this is Aaron. They're old, I mean they're not that old horsemen, but they've been horse people ever since they were kids. Cathie was a special ed teacher, rodeo, barrel racer, and I find it very proud of her that she was the first female master of foxhounds, or leader of a fox hunt, of the last Army fox hunt at Fort Leavenworth, and she broke a glass ceiling that existed for 100+ years. Erin is also a long-term rider, military officer. Her sister was going to be here, but she's stuck in Phoenix. So if you plan on getting there on an airplane anytime soon, you know, take the bus. But a great rider, been involved in many, many horse activities to include fox hunting. Presently at Fort Riley as the physician assistant for the 1st of the 63rd Army. So without further ado, they're going to tell you about Iceland.
Thanks for coming this morning. Glad to have you all. All right. So we'll go ahead and shoot to the next slide for us.
I can do that.
We decided to pick a girls' trip, and my sister, who's in the audience, and we're there in the jean jacket, and I have twin daughters, Erin and her sister Tess. Tess, of course, was held up by flight, so she didn't make it today. And I had a girlfriend who's in her 70s, so we all decided to look for a tour group that we could do a horse trip. And we found this group online called Wild Women Expeditions. And it's an all-women group run out of Canada, and they travel the entire world. And everywhere they go, they empower women guides from those countries. So they give back to those communities that provide the service for us. This particular trip in Iceland was to ride Icelandic horses. And we chose that because it's a horse that you don't see very often in the United States. They're gaited horses, but they are few and far between in ranches here in the United States. And we'll tell more about that later. We chose Iceland because it was not in the United States. It was a country that was very open. Towards the end of COVID, they were very friendly to Americans and encouraged people to come. And in the island, they've been vaccinated like 75%. So it was a pretty risk-free environment. Erin being in the Army had to approve the area for her to go to being fairly risk-free. Iceland is about the size of Kentucky. Its population is about half of Louisville, which is about 350,000, I believe. And it probably should be called Greenland instead of Iceland, and Greenland should be called Iceland because their countries are very, very different. The flight from our east coast is probably about 2,500 miles. The flight took us about 8 hours, wouldn't you say, for us to get there? Next slide.
All right. So before we get into what we're waiting for, the horses, I kind of wanted to do a little bit of trivia on an animal that does show up in Iceland. It's actually not native to Iceland. I'm going to see if you guys can guess it. That is the good news, but they do happen to make the trip via ice flow and a little bit of swimming. So they're actually endemic towards the northern hemisphere, have a really big shaggy coat, and they eat meat. Can you guys guess what it is?
Polar bear.
Polar bear! Bing, 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 bing. I should have brought prizes. I'd throw a piece of candy. or throw something cool. But yeah, my budget's a little low for that right now. But so it is a polar bear. They're not very commonly, they don't come to Iceland very often, but when they do, they show up on the coasts, and they've been sighted there a time or two. So move on to the next slide.
Lucky for you, we didn't run into any polar bears while we were there.
Lucky.
They have very few natural diseases in that country. They don't have any rabies, and they don't have very many animals. The polar bear is one that shows up, and the next slide is the Arctic fox. They're pretty nocturnal, so we didn't view any of those either in the areas that we were in. But everything else we saw were animals that have been imported. There were a lot of birds. I couldn't probably tell you all the names of the different birds that we were supposed to see. We didn't see very many, but I was trying to think. We didn't see any natural wildlife. No deer.
Just sheep.
No, yeah,
sheep.
they were also imported. Next slide.
All right. So before we can get there, we've got to get across the ocean. So there's some fun to be had at Trial Bay Airport, right? It was about a 7 to 8 hour flight, so lots of hanging out and chatting. But if we'll move to our next slide, we did have quite a good view, as mentioned by our pilot. So pilots like Northern Lights on our, what was it?
Port side.
On our port side.
down there in a heartbeat and had that hot dog gone. And then the whole bunch came in. It was like the movie The Birds. All of a sudden they got word there's hot dogs in town.
Watch your food.
But the food tours are really good. If you go to any of these trips, the food tours will take you around and you'll get to meet a lot of people and just see a lot of neat things. Next slide, Rob. One of our stops, this was the one Janie was kind of mentioning earlier, is I think they do this to travelers just for fun, because a lot of the young people there don't have anything to do with this. It's always the elder people. But they give you a Viking beer, which is not their best beer. It's because it's Viking, but their best beer was Gullfoss. But this particular beer, we got beef jerky in the tall thing, which tasted salty and terrible.
That's fish jerky.
It was fish jerky, sorry. And then in the little enclosed glass is their delicacy, which is called shark. And this shark is very unique to the Greenland area. It's a deep sea diving shark. It does not have kidneys, so its urine comes out through its skin. And so it's a very toxic shark. At some point, the Vikings learned that this would kill you if you eat it fresh. So when they catch these sharks, they take the meat and they slice it up and put it in the ground with heavy rocks on top of it to press that urea out, and they let them ferment for several weeks. And then they take them out of the ground and hang them in barns and let them dry until they develop kind of a brown crust around them, and then they slice that off, and then the meat you're supposed to be able to eat. Well, they sold it in the grocery stores, and they had us with a little toothpick with it, and I'll explain that in a minute. But this shark is really interesting. It is the longest lived vertebrate on the planet. And they did some carbon dating of the eye to find out that they live 250 to 500 years. And they're very large. They get, I can't remember, 600-700 pounds. Is that what we decided? And they still fish for them, and they do still eat them there, but they have to go through that process or you would die. So next slide. When we got our little things, we got to taste one of those, and that's what happens when you put it in your mouth.
Revenge.
It's about the size of a dime.
Oh, yeah. Dim the lights on my picture.
Perfect. You all put them in your mouth at the same time, and it's a very, very strong odor of ammonia. And Gordon Ramsay did this on his show one day as a chef, and he put it in his mouth and said it tasted like a piece of mattress. And that was probably a good description. Once you got in your mouth, you really didn't want to chew it or swallow it.
It requires a beer.
Yeah, it requires at least a beer. Okay, next slide. But of course, they do eat horse meat there. We didn't taste any, but it is available to be eaten there. And at the ranch where we went, they said as their horses are no longer used, they all are of service, so then they go to be used for horse meat. So that, we just didn't choose to try it. Next slide. But on this trip, we had several ladies in our group, and we had 2 guides. Anina on the right was our guide from Germany, and she was very experienced. She'd been a guide there since her teens. She looks like she's still in her teens, but she was in her 20s. And then the guide on the left that's kneeling, Laura, she was from Denmark, and this was her first, she's a very experienced horsewoman, but this was her first time guiding. So we had a great group. And in our group, there was our 5 that went together, my daughters and my 7-year-old friend and my sister. And then there were some other sisters there, and the unique thing about that, my 7-year-old friend lived in McCall, Idaho. 2 of the sisters were from McCall, Idaho, and they didn't know each other and ended up on the same trip. But all of us were from the U.S. We had some from New York, one from New Jersey in that group. So next slide.
All right, so we had to settle into our guest house. The place we went to was called the Farm Villiers, and they hosted El Hestar, Icelandic Horses, and trail rides. So it was a very, very nice place. You had the guest house, I think a little bit like if you were to go off to the left, the barns would be over there. So they had a little indoor
This shows more of our gear. Next one, Rob. And it shows the saddles. We were kind of worried about, getting chafed, so we hear online that, you needed bicycle pants that are padded. Well, you didn't need anything. The padded saddles were very comfortable. They're English type, a little lot like dressage. It's like trail riding Western, but in an English saddle. And you were assigned your saddle for the week. So you had like a ribbon or something tied on the back of the saddle so it identified yours, and you could always get the same one. They didn't worry about saddle fit on the horses. We did not use saddle pads because if they get wet or bunched up, they would gall the horses. So the saddles were just put directly on them. And these were not really, they weren't what I would call clean, but each guide was in charge of having their own stack of saddles and bridles that they were to keep clean. But they were kind of going from tour to tour, so there wasn't a lot of time for them to do a lot of that. Next slide.
All right, so after learning about the gear, we do have to learn how to ride this type of horse. I do want to talk about a little bit first about the Icelandic horse in particular. Nina is not a very tall lady. She's probably about my height, maybe a little bit shorter. So they're not tall horses. You might think, hey, that looks like a pony. Yes, by definition it is a pony. Probably the average size is between 13 and 15 hands. So if you think of how tall that is, it's not tall. But do not call them a pony in Iceland. You'll be corrected pretty quickly. Like, no, they're an Icelandic horse. So the Icelandic horse was initially kept very pure by the Icelandic people. They do have very stringent quarantine and entrance requirements into the country. These horses aren't required to get any vaccinations. They don't have any endemic diseases over here. So one thing to remember is if you decide to purchase an Icelandic horse, it's not going to be able to be allowed to go back into Iceland. Once it leaves its home country, it never returns. So there's a sense of finality to that. Kind of a quick, how many people, like we've got some Western riders in here. Do we have any dressage, eventing, trail riding? Yeah, awesome. Like the riding we do is very similar to, I'd say trail, like you do ride English, but you also think of it similar, I think of it similar to saddle seat. And I don't ride saddle seat, but there are certain gaits that kind of feel very similar. So I'll talk about that here in a second. So I'll move us to the next slide. All right, so we learned how to mount. And so if you think about the typical pony, they don't have a lot of wither. They have a very flat wither and a very round, flat back, flat and short back. And so if you were to put all of your weight into one stirrup, that saddle is going to come sliding no matter how tight your girth is. So the big challenge of the day was could you mount without a girth? That's pretty challenging. You can see my sister on the left, she's mounting like you would typically would in an English saddle. She's a little bit farther from the horse than it would be more conducive to sliding your saddle. Her saddle did slide. If you stay closer to the horse, the big trick is that you've got to really have a lot of weight on the other side of that saddle so it doesn't go sliding. And so even when you do have a girth, you've got to make sure that when you get that left leg up, you're really pushing down hard onto the right side of the saddle. And so that's really how you mount with an Icelandic horse. You're going to see a little plywood.
But they let you use a girth.
Right. Yeah, no girthless riding here. That'd be the ultimate challenge, right? So if you see that plywood aisleway or catwalk in the middle, I'll move us to our next slide. That catwalk was used to train us on the gaits of how these horses move. So if we think about how our horses move here at home, we have the walk, the trot, the canter and gallop. Iceland kind of considers its canter and gallop as the same gait. So when you hear a 4 and 5 gaited horse, they're considering that to be one gait. In an Icelandic horse, you have two additional gaits. The one is the tolt, so that's a 4-beat gait, which I'll tell you about in a second. And then the flying pace, which is, I'd consider it probably a 2-beat gait, but it's a little different from the trot. So talking back about the tolt, it's a very, very smooth gait, and it's a very, very quick gait. So if you think of the trot being a diagonal 2-beat gait, the tolt is 4 beats, so you have very little suspension. So as she was riding along in the tolt on that plywood catwalk there, you'd hear kind of, and so that's what the tolt feels like, and that's also what it feels like underneath you. Very, very smooth. There's a challenge that if you could carry a beer and not spill the drop, that's how you're supposed to do it in Iceland. Moving on to the flying pace. So if you think of how a horse trots, the two diagonal legs moving at the same time. For the pace, it's actually the two parallel legs moving at the same time, and so it's an incredibly fast gait. And I'm not lying when I tell you this. A really good flying pace Icelandic horse could probably go 25 to 30 miles an hour. It's very fast. And so that's pretty much trained in your show quality horses. We had a couple in our group that were trained to do that, and they did it when they were allowed to go flat out. So it's incredibly fast, and it's cool to feel. There were some horses that were a little lazy and not quite so well trained, and they'd go into a piggy pace, which is kind of like a camel amble. So you really had to ask them to do it properly. So how do you ask for the tolt? Well, if you think of maybe it's a little different than Western. You've got a little more contact with the reins, and you do some half halts, have some contact with their head, ask them to get their weight more back to their haunches, and then you kind of squeeze that tube of toothpaste, push them into that contact, and they start going. So it's pretty cool. Some horses were harder to tolt than others, so that's what was fun about riding different horses. Next slide for us.
After we got educated on how to ride and how to mount, they took us out on our first trail ride. The picture at the bottom shows the bridles they used. Each horse rode in the same snaffle, just a little loose ring snaffle, and they had a headband or a noseband that we would put on over that to keep their mouth closed, and it had a loop on it. So every time we would stop, we would pull that headband off, put it around our neck so we didn't lose it, and the horse then would be allowed to graze. So every one of the stops were feeding times for the horses as well, because we would take their long rein and they would graze for however long we took a break for lunch or snacks. But this was our first attempt at saddling up and helping each other getting saddled, and safety checks. The guys were very good about going around and checking that. And you can kind of see the difference in the sizes. This chestnut on the end, was one of the taller horses we had in our group, but most of them were probably, that one in the bay, that white one is probably about the size a lot of them were, which were probably, what do you think, around 13 hands would be my guess.
Between 13 and 14.
Yeah.
I think most of the taller ones weren't much over 14.
I think we had one 15 hand at Aaron Road.
And
Next slide.
Are you going to tell them we rode a different horse every day?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And so we moved from here, next slide, to the paddock. And the paddock was just to get us used to our horse. We let him around a little bit, waited till we got our safety check to get on. And you can see my favorite horse was the one in the bottom, and she was maybe 13 hands. That little mare was a show horse, and she could do the flying. They call it the flying toss.
Her name was Gracia.
Yeah, and she was one of our favorites.
Sporty.
Yeah, that was it. That was her favorite.
They don't worry about the weight.
No,
They
these
can
ponies,
carry.
these horses, they
Uh-huh.
say will carry up to 280
So
pounds.
there's
Wow.
a weight limit.
There is. The trip had a weight limit.
Yeah.
I think if you were
240.
over 240, 250.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we had some pretty good
Yeah.
sized gals in our trip that were tall and big, and they would just make sure the horse you got was one more adapt
Yeah.
for that. But I was amazed. We traded horses throughout the ride, so we always had extra horses you'll see with us, and so they were rotated. The horses were not ridden by the same person the entire 3 or 4 hour trail ride.
And you have to answer a pretty specific list of questions
Yeah,
about your
before you
riding
go.
experience.
Yeah.
And they have a graph they work on every day of horses and riders, and they grade, if you're an A rider or a B rider, and then they grade the horses. So
Right.
they're really good at pairing up
They're very good
your
at that.
experience and with the horse.
Hey, next slide, we're off on our first trail ride. So the goal of this trail ride was about 3 hours for our very first one, but we stayed pretty much on dirt paths, and we rode around the farm and looked at their horses out in pastures. They had pastures that were vacation pastures that they were turned out to. They had mares and foals and pastures. This particular ranch didn't have any stallions. They have stallion farms where they would breed their mares and then bring them back, but they didn't keep any stallions on this particular farm. And they told us they had 250 horses. Pre-COVID, they had 350, but during that time, they just couldn't keep them all and feed them, so their herd went down to 250, which still, there were horses everywhere. They'd bring them in, run them in the morning up the alleyways, and back out at night, back out to their fields. Anyway, we saw a little bit of the fauna that we were going to see and the grass we'd be going through. A lot of these were hay fields and pastures. Next slide. That was also our only sunny day. We had a little bit of sun peek out. probably rode through more than just one farm, because to get that 3-hour loop, we made a great big loop around this farm. Next slide. And I can't remember the name of this mountain, but that was one they kept talking about, the poets had written about. But again, you can kind of see there's terraces, and the horses were just kept with like one hot wire. So the fields would just have one hot wire, and that would be the field they stayed in. And one of the fields we came into had loose horses, and the guides were able to back those horses off kind of with the wire, the hot wire, and we got through, and then they put it back up, and they didn't really mess with us. But the temperaments are unbelievable in these horses. Next slide. So actually, our running trip was 8 solid days. We rode at least 3 to 6 hours a day. Some days were, you knew you were riding 6 hours. We averaged about 11 to 15 miles pretty much a day, but that was our range. They did recommend you get into a little bit of riding shape before you go. Like my girlfriend didn't have she had ridden her whole life, but she had nowhere to ride. So she probably was a little more sore than most. Plus she was 70, so that was probably a little bit of it. But she was in pretty good shape for hiking and walking and that type of thing. Next slide. This one yours there?
This is yours, Mom. We'll take the next one.
Well, the next day we took off for what we call the Valley of the Horses. And you can see the land as we got out into the valley became more rugged, a little more jagged. Of course, all of Iceland is a volcano, so everything is lava rock, and some places where trails are made. This was now obviously a big traveled area in some of the areas we rode through, but we didn't see anybody. We saw one hiker the entire time. The rest of the time it was just our group. We were the only thing out there, and sheep. We'd occasionally see groups of 3 or 4 sheep. Next slide.
Alright, so the Icelandic name for the Valley of the Horses is Murardelur. And so really what it was used for is for travelers as they brought their, livestock, sheep, herds of horses, they were able to stop at the valley, be able to guard it at one end, put a guard at the other end, and your horses would be safe for the night and have plenty of grass to stay the night. So getting there, we had to go over quite a bit of terrain. So we had a lot of water crossings. We had a lot of elevation changes. And so there were parts that were rocky enough that we needed to get off the horses. It was kind of funny because the horses knew this trail so well that if you were going a little too slow, they'd give you a little boot to tell you to move up, hurry up. And so it was pretty muddy that day too, so you really had to watch your step. It was really slippery at times, but loads of fun, Moving to our next slide. We had many geothermal sites along the way. Water would get super hot, super heated underneath the ground, and so that's what caused geysers to erupt. And we'll talk a little more about geysers later in our presentation. We'll move on to our next slide, and you can see some more of the terrain. So again, we say this was one of our sunny days. A lot of cloud cover. But, the rest of the time you'll see how it was. But very lush. You have a lot of moss, grass, a lot of good eating for the horses, and it was very muddy out there. Next slide for me, please.
And they provide the lovely orange rain
They
suits
do.
that you'll see us in most of the time because it rained all the time.
And we
Yes.
thought that they would be very hot and uncomfortable, but we were
You
very
did.
happy to have them.
So talking layers, like as Janie said, like these hot orange rain suits kind of look like we're Ghostbusters, but at the end of the day, you needed them. We had a lot of rain. It was able to keep the rain out of your layers, and if you're wet, you're cold. So then you start worrying about potentially succumbing to the elements and being pretty uncomfortable. So we finally were in the valley. It was here that we took a really nice lunch break, took the saddles and bridles off the horses, let them rest for a bit, and we got to enjoy the sights and have a rest ourselves. So again, great fun.
Pretty beansy, aren't they?
Pretty beansy.
But you didn't feel like that when you were on them.
No.
They moved it like a horse, you didn't have a feeling like it was a small horse. I would felt a couple times like I was too big for like that one that was my favorite, but she didn't have any problem carrying weight.
So I'm trying to think of some of the names here. I think we had Spori, Gretia,
Cowley.
Cowley, that's either Blika or Ida, I can't really tell. And then probably Thracia and maybe Fiora. I kind of messed the names up a little bit. But they each had their own name. If you could remember them all, you were awesome. Next slide for me, please. So this is the valley. So on that other end, kind of in between those two rock formations, that's likely where they'd be able to put a guard. So it'd be pretty easy to keep your horses
temperatures ranged around 40 to 60, would kind of go up and down depending on if you had a little bit of sun. But most of the time it was kind of gloomy like this, but you didn't really notice. You can see the guide in front. Anina has 2 horses with her. The guides would pony the extra horses we took along in case you had a problem with a horse we needed extra. And it always gave 2 a rest period. So she was actually ponying the one in the center, and that center horse had a surcingle on it that the second horse was attached to, and they've been trained to travel like that. So they did it really quite well. Even on the narrow trails, they managed really quite well. Next slide.
What time of the year was this?
We went in August. Yeah, it was about mid-August.
Mm-hmm.
And the week before us had beautiful weather. They had 60 and sunny every day. And the brochure shows sunny weather. We didn't have
Okay, it was okay.
Yeah.
We had about it was about 18 hours of daylight. Yeah.
This lake that we rode to was the largest lake in Iceland. It's called Thingvellir. And they told us to bring head nets, which we did. Most of us did. I think one of the guides, a German guide, didn't have a head net that first day. She got one after that. But anytime you got close to big water, like a lake or the ocean, the only insect that I saw there was this black fly. And it didn't bite, but it would get in your nose and in your tear ducts, your mouth. It was just nasty. So the head nets were a lifesaver. If you ever go on those trips, it's worth having one in your pocket just because some kind of insect is going to get you. Next slide. This is where the tectonic plates meet. And Iceland is increasing about 2 centimeters a year as the plates are separating. So the North American and the Eurasian plates are separating in this location. And we rode through areas where they pointed that out on several occasions. Next slide. So Iceland is actually growing.
Oh,
Then we rode from those tectonic plates. This line or yours?
I can take it, that's
Okay.
fine. So it's from those tectonic plates down to the moor. We were able to do more horse changes, potty breaks, and snacks. So you definitely take advantage of those breaks because it was always a good time to get some steps for your feet there.
And that's usually when they would maybe have us switch horses. So if you had a horse that you didn't get along with very well, or it was up too much horse for you, or you wanted more of an energetic horse, they would trade them around so you got a chance to ride several.
So next slide for us, please. At this point, we went ahead and loaded horses onto a trailer. So they were going to meet us at our next sleeping area, or a mountain hut, so to speak. So we'll talk about that here in a second. We got to sightsee at Thingvellir National Park. This place was very famous for being, a place that for hundreds of years they would have trials take place for people who maybe did some wrong to the people. And they also had parliamentary meetings here. So it was a cool historical landmark. I'll move us to our next slide. Again, sightseeing. This was one of the sites where they would have those meetings, and you can see it was a little chilly that day. We have a lot of layers on. So if you do decide to go on this trip, bring your layers. You won't regret it.
And a wool gaiter. That wool
And a
gaiter
gaiter.
saved us.
Break the wind against your face. Next slide. All right.
Then we went to this lodge. I would say lodge. It's a sheep herder's hut. And this is a famous one because a lot of their trail riders there use this as an overnight staying place. So we had separate rooms with some bunk beds in we could stay in, and there was a big, large community room. And that was the only time we had a man in our group because the normal woman chef that followed us was getting married. We didn't know that at the time, but so they sent a male chef in, and he cooked a wonderful meal for us at night. Every night we had some kind of chef, phenomenal local fare. And they were usually potato type meals with fish or lamb. Trying to think, but I think pretty much what we had was fish or lamb. You can see the rock walls where the sheep are kept, and it fascinates me because I'm thinking, how do they know which sheep are theirs? We'd see sheep out there in groups of 2 or 3 or 5, but they were all over in this national area. But I didn't see any ear tags or anything on them, and it's a big deal when they all get together. The farmers bring out their best horses, and they come out and it's like a big party. They go around and ride the countryside, find the sheep, and bring them in very large herds into these areas then where they have shearers that come in and shear off the wool. It's a big export for Iceland. Next slide. And that was the only place, that place and this place, we had hay that was brought in for the horses. So they kept their horses well taken care of. This was the next into the wilderness, basically, except when you would find these huts. But there was one blacktop road that went north, and it closes down for the winter when it gets icy and snowy. So if you were to live in any of these areas, once winter came, you didn't leave those areas, so you had to be prepared for that. But they graciously let us stay there in this little hut. It had probably 2 levels of bunk beds that were, I think, probably 8 to 10 beds at each level, just packed in there, and that's where we slept. And then they brought in a chef for us that was a lady, and she was from Poland. And Erin spent 10 months in the military in Poland, and so she learned several different words and taught us things that we would say to her. So when she came in, we would greet her in Polish and say thank you in Polish. And she was an incredible cook. We had an unbelievable food. Next slide. So the horses are like any horses anywhere. When they get a chance to lay down and roll, they're going to get up and shake. And the minute we got there, they knew that was the place to go roll. They headed for those old hay piles and rolled. Next slide. And the test was to see if you saw anything in that slide that might have been a miss. Did you notice anything? I didn't notice it until my husband pointed it out. But next slide. We needed to give that horse a little bit of attention because the rocks were everywhere, and we did pick their feet out. At the end of the day, the guides did, and then that was part of our tacking up every morning. We had to make sure their feet were picked out. But I found the shoes to be very interesting too. I think they're all handmade. They had a German farrier on site at the barn, and he probably had 200 or 300 shoes in there. And I think they just reuse them. One comes off, put it on another horse. But they were all pretty much very heavy, drafty looking type shoe. I think we brought one back, didn't we?
Did they heat them up? Or are they just cold?
I didn't see a forge.
No.
We went into the farrier's
That's a really good question.
area, and I didn't see a forge, and he was not very talkative. He wasn't somebody you could really
He was a little grumpy.
engage. He was a little grumpy.
Good guy.
Well, 200 horses, you have to take feet for.
Can you imagine? I can't imagine. And they had to have their feet ready for us before we
Right.
left on our
Yeah.
trip.
So they
Next
probably
slide.
they made the foot fit the shoe.
They did.
Yeah.
Yeah, and their feet are kind of longer and narrower, but each of our guides carried a farrier pack with them on their horses. And in that pack, they'd have shoes, a file, and a puller. And so they had some training. They didn't want to have to do it if they didn't have to, but Nina could tack a shoe back on or pull a shoe if a horse had a problem. And I think we had one horse lose a shoe, and they just left that horse without that shoe. They pulled the shoe, but they
And they took the rider off.
yeah, took the rider off, and the horse wasn't ridden anymore on that leg.
He wasn't horribly rocky at that time.
No, but I happened to pick up one of these packs. They were pretty heavy.
Yeah.
And they hook them on the back of their saddle, and then they put a crupper around the horse to hold it steady in the center of the horse. Next slide. We let the horses have a break while we went to see another one of their tourist areas, and this was called the Gullfoss, which is what their beer is named after. It was a very famous waterfall in Iceland. Next slide. And the story behind this waterfall is the farmer that owned it was being approached by England to sell that for a hydroelectric plant. And his daughter was very upset. She did not want that sold to them. She didn't want it dammed up. She wanted it left like it was. And so there was a big family feud for many years. And then her father died in 1957, and somebody in the family then sold this area to the government, and they turned it into a national area to come see. But if you notice the path that leads to it, you walk clear out there, and one of the things that interested me was how they don't have the safety factors that we have here for their things that you go to see. Like it would be fenced off, and they did have a rope. I mean, you stay behind the rope, but it's all just kind of on your own. Be careful. But the waterfall was very, very impressive. Next slide. Here's what's more of the waterfall. Another view, but you can see how they get their electricity from their water. They do use electricity there. So all of their areas like this that are dammed up are producing that. Next slide. Then we went back to the shuttle, and we made it to the area where they have their geysers. And that's another touristy area that you could come into. But it was very interesting in that the geysers go off kind of like old Yellowstone, but they go off every 7 minutes. And again, you see there's just a little rope that kind of keeps you out of the area, maybe a wooden this water is very, very hot, and you were gonna get burned from it. But the actual geyser had like a little center in it, and it would start off with just like a little bubble, and then just within seconds that bubble would erupt. And while we were there, one of them had a double eruption, which they say doesn't happen very often. We hoped it would happen again so we could videotape it, but then we didn't get a double again. But it was kind of fascinating. And you know, the whole island is all volcanic, so they have a lot of fissures. Like you'd be riding along and you'd see steam just coming up out of the ground where those fissures were. And I think in one of the slides we had a big long pipeline, and that was their water traveling. You never ran out of hot water, and the water was very hot in showers because that's fed all of their cities and their different areas. That's how you got your water.
So did you have on those camp places that you went where did you have functioning showers and bathrooms?
We had a bathroom. We did not have showers.
No showers.
That little tiny sheep hut or
Yeah.
quarters hut. I think there was a capability to take a shower there, but
No.
we didn't
It was
choose
all
to. There was an
sketchy.
outdoor, but it was a toilet, of
Yeah.
course. So you know.
And electricity was out there?
Yes, it did have electricity in all of those areas. I don't think we had any place that was that
That
primitive.
first
Yeah.
camp, there wasn't any electricity, was there? There
Yeah,
wasn't,
it
where
did.
the Polish.
Yeah,
there
it did
it had
have some.
power.
It had like a couple of light switches. I think.
It didn't have a lot of light, but it had
Yeah.
power.
Oh, wait.
And she cooked her meal on the grill,
Maybe
and,
it did.
Okay.
and then there was a wood stove she fired up, so that's what we're using, wood
Nice.
stove for
Yeah.
heat.
Well, and she cooked lamb on the grill outside in the rain.
Yeah.
We loved her, but.
Next slide. Oh, she was phenomenal.
All right, so after that, a couple of us went back on the horses to see a special rental property, which I'll move us to our next slide. So the Icelandic people called these people the cave people. This was on Linda Scheide Moor, so it was inhabited until the 1940s, but was also lived in and restored by a family of descendants. So these people lived in the caves, did their farming, sheep herding, they had children here, cooked meals. So they lived in the remnants of the lava flows. So it was pretty cool. You could look inside and see how they lived back then. Next slide for me, please.
You could pay to go in, but we didn't pay to go in. Then we had to what's called the drift. And the drift are these trails that go through the grassy areas, and they've been traveled for so many years, you know, from sheep and hikers and horses, that they get very deep and they have to abandon that trail and start a new one beside it. But then the grass grows over it, so they become very dangerous to travel because, you know, you fall several feet when you think you're on grass. So they made a real point to tell us we had to stay behind our guides because the guides knew where to go. And I got off a couple of times just because I guess I was thinking I was going to make my own way, and I learned real quickly to stay behind a guide. But that's what riding the drift is called. And again, we didn't see anybody. It was just us out on the trail. That was really phenomenal to think that. And pretty much everywhere we went, you could see the fissures where there's some of the steam coming up out of the ground. Again, you would see that as we were riding along. That area had a fenced off area, so that was probably going into that sheep herder's hut. Next slide. As we rode along, I couldn't quite figure out how the guides could figure out where they were going. And then she pointed out they have trail markers that they don't know who made them. They've probably been there for hundreds of years. But along the trails, there would be markers that looked like that she would look for. And, you know, I'm just, because I thought if we lose our guide, nobody will find us. We wouldn't be able to get out of there. But they also had trail markers. So you go along in some of the hiking areas, you might find an actual street sign that would tell them where they were going. Next slide. So we kept riding back down to the Thingvellir Lake again and back to our head nets because we were getting close to water again. But again, they're showing how they ponied the horse with the surcingle. And so those horses were getting a rest from being ridden. Next slide. Head nets went on. We were by that big lake. It was really pretty. Big, beautiful area. You can't see, he really couldn't do justice to show the size of the lake. Next slide. But you can tell by that, we were quickly getting our nets on because that black fly was just annoying. They just didn't bite, but they were all over your face and in your eyes. And that's where we saw some people. We stopped at this lake to water the horses, and so we did run into some people that had stopped there wishing they had head nets on.
Did it bother the horses as
It,
bad as?
you know, their hair was always, you could hardly figure out how they could even see because their manes are incredibly thick. But I would see them on their eyes, but I didn't see them shake their heads or move it. So, anyway, we went back to the horses went to the trailers, and we're trailered back to the farm, and we were trailered back to where we were staying. Next slide.
Alright, so our next day was probably the worst weather we had. It was driving wind, driving rain, really muddy. Kind of something out of a Lord of the Rings movie. That's what we were riding through. But our goal was to get to the hot springs. So the geothermal energy heats the water, and so up closer to the source you'd have very hot water. As you go down the mountain, the water would get cooler. So we had the opportunity to get into the hot springs or swim in them. So we'll go to our next slide. We got to a part in the trail where the guides would stay with the horses. You had about a 2.5 mile hike into the hot springs. And so here we were sharing the trail with some hikers, so they would give us some funny looks. But I'll move to our next slide. My sister and I were the only ones brave enough to get into the hot spring. Weather was probably, I don't know, in the 50s, and the water was pretty warm, but getting out you were a little uncomfortable. So as you can see, that was the weather during the day. We were pretty soaked. So
You notice there aren't a lot of people in there.
no, there's not.
Those other 4 people were actually from the United States.
Yeah, there were.
But none of the locals, they were all hiking up there, but they weren't getting in.
And the next slide shows the rest of our group who would not join
We
us.
didn't get in.
That particular day, we were wet, soaked to the
Yeah.
underwear. I don't know why. I mean, I don't know how the water gets in those orange suits, but it does. And every one of us was soaked. Our clothes were soaked,
Yeah.
and it was miserable. And nobody wanted to take them off because you know how hard it is to put on wet clothes. So we just said, nah.
And we couldn't see that day because the clouds had come into the mountain, but we were actually on mountain trails. The path was probably about 3 to 4 feet wide, so you had hikers and you had to let them take the high side, and the horses took the side over the edge. And I have a real fear of heights, so I was really glad I couldn't see, because I know that went straight down on a couple occasions, and they had put me on a very green horse that day, and there were little kids in ponchos that the wind was blowing, so they're walking along and these ponchos were flying, and trike would come by, or strollers, and most of those horses just went on. The horse in front of me, the poor gal in front of me, that horse spooked and went flying up the side of the mountain with me right behind her.
Alright, so after, the rain makes you pretty cold, we did get back to get hot showers and have some camaraderie and card games. And so that brought us to one of our last riding days. So next slide for us.
And this was kind of the highlight of the trip, was to get to ride the Black Beach along the ocean. So you had to go during low tide. And it was a 4-hour ride. It had rained all night long, and the rivers were swollen, probably over our knees on our horses. How the guides could find their way through the creeks, I couldn't figure that out. Then I saw white poles sticking out in the middle of the creek, so they had marked places for them to go through on rock bottoms. But the 4-hour ride was pretty miserable. We were pretty cold, but none of us were going to give up, because they gave us the option to not go. It was like, oh, are you kidding? So we get to the Black Beach, and they said, we're going to tolt along the Black Beach. Well, we started off tolting, and then
We hauled butt across the Black
we
Beach.
started, what they call a gallop is haul ass.
I thought they said it was a canter.
Well, I think she did call it a canter, but
Yeah.
that means, and they would give you chances along the ride where you were going uphill, where if you didn't want to canter, then you could go on up the hill with a guide, and the rest of you could stay back and then haul ass up the hill, which we did that a couple of times. Well, more than a couple.
But this is a group of 12 horses.
Yeah.
And you get them going all together, and it was all.
And when we were on the
It was
beach, we
on.
started off taunting, and then our guide, Anina, she would say, ya ya, when it was time to canter, and the horses knew that, and you better be ready, because she would raise her hand first to warn you, and then she'd say, ya ya, and off you go. And usually would start at a tolt, unless you're going up a hill, and then that was to go as fast as you could. But we got to stand on the beach, you could see the ocean behind us, we couldn't really see it, we could hear it, but we met the buses there, a bus there for us, and the trailers came and took away the horses.
Yeah, so we had come to the end of our riding trip, so we had to say goodbye to our guides and our horses. But kind of cool, I'll move you to our next slide. At the end of a big tour like this, whether it's the slow or the fast riding tour, each horse is going to get about a 3-month vacation out at pasture. So at the end of the trip, you'd have the guides herding all of our horse friends out to where they can just relax. For us, it was waiting on the bus to get back to Reykjavik. But our trip wasn't quite over yet. I'll take us through what we did really quickly because I know we're a little short on time. But we went to a really cool Icelandic museum called the Perlin. And it was really cool because it talked about Icelandic geography, history, as well as got to go to a fully fledged authentic ice cave. And I'll go to our next slide. So we went to the Blue Lagoon, which it is a spa. So the water is heated by geothermal energy. You get a bunch of creams for your face. It's a great time. So if you're pretty tired after a week of hard riding on the Icelandic horses, come to an Icelandic spa.
And it was not very crowded that day because it was raining.
It was raining.
Raining.
All right. So our next slide shows us enjoying the food that we got to.
Weird,
The food and beer, yes. And so our trip here is coming to an end, but it's time to go back to the good old US of A. What I will say in closing is that if you're apprehensive about this type of trip, don't be. We had a age range probably of me and my sister in our early 30s, all the way up to awesome ladies in their 60s and 70s. So if you can sit on a horse and enjoy the ride, you can absolutely go on this type of trip, and we encourage it. So we had a lot of fun. We hope you guys do too if you decide to go.
Do you have any questions?
So is she your older sister or
No, wait a minute. Don't let the hair color fool you.
she's a little bossy.
She's very
I have
bossy.
5 sisters, so that's why I'm saying she's a little bossy, so I'm gonna assume she's your older sister.
No, I'm the oldest one. I keep dragging her on horse trips all over. I try not to give her much time to think about it because if I do, she's going to say no. So I'll say, yeah, I got like 10 minutes. You got to
Cathie is now going in August to Ireland to ride horses.
Yeah, I'm going with the same tour group. And if you have sisters or daughters, this particular tour group is phenomenal. And it's only for women, or you have to identify as a woman if you go.
What's the name of it?
Wild Women Expeditions.
Women.
You can look them up on Facebook. And I'm not doing a plug for them, but my friend has she's gone to Wild Indonesia, she's gone to Baja. We're going to do the trip in Ireland to ride Connemara horses. And then she's talking me into, in 2023, they do one at the Azores. They have a horse ride and whale watching and dolphin watching. She did sea kayaking in the Baja area, and she's 70. They make allowances for you. If you're the weak link, they will help you. You see people take a real growth during the trip, and you get real close to the people that are with you.
So how many days was the actual whole trip?
We took 10 days because we had the COVID test. So
Okay.
on the way home, they had COVID tested stations all over. You had to sign up and go to them. And we had a day on the front side just because we wanted to spend some time in the city and do the food tour. And we had to get sleeping bags. We rented sleeping bags, so we had to go to wherever that was and you have to walk everywhere. So that was about a 2-mile hike just to get the sleeping bags.
About
And so
8
then you
days
were
riding.
8 days riding, and then the other
And then we
days.
built in, but some of the other ladies didn't build in the extra time.
Okay.
And they were they couldn't do the Blue Lagoon or even some of the things that we wanted to stick around and do.
Yeah.
But if you could do a day on either side of the trip, that's enough time. Like when we go to Ireland, we'll fly into Dublin and we have to take a train from there to Galway. And then we'll meet up with the group in Galway. And once you get there, it's all inclusive. So you know, your food, everything is taken care of. So you think it's a little pricey until you look at what you really
What you're paying
get.
for.
Yeah. And the food was just amazing because they use chefs. Now the rest of the people there weren't eating the same food we had. We shared breakfast, you know, it was a typical European breakfast of yogurt, nuts, meats, cheese.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we stayed in a hotel in Reykjavik that they call them center hotels. There's several of them, but we got a little lost, a little turned around trying to find the food tour, and finally made our way there. Part of it was construction was in the way, but we had a great tour guide, you know, and it's just amazing to me that we ran into people from Oklahoma, the same food tour. They had a beer tour that we'd signed up for, but at that point we figured we could go drink beer anywhere we wanted to. We didn't. I think it was similar to the food tour, but it was just beer.
You became regulars at the American Bar.
Yeah, we found a place in Reykjavik called the American Bar, and they played pretty much 80s music, and they had all kinds of American actors on the wall, and they had saved us a table for their band that came in after we got done. Of course, we looked pretty bad by the end.
It's like that bar in Manhattan called the Library.
Yeah, but it was a lot of fun. I think it was worth every penny. The flights used to be cheaper, you know, but because of COVID, the flights were a little higher. You used to be able to get a direct flight to Iceland from Kansas City for $400.
Yeah.
And those weren't anymore. So we actually flew out of Minneapolis because my girlfriend
how they do their horses so different.
Yeah.
Here, you know, sometimes I can be a fair weather rider, and to know they ride in the rain no matter.
Yeah.
You just go.
You had no problems with dust or heat, right?
No.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, and the
Bugs,
flies,
it's a
like
black
you just
bug.
had the bugs down by
Yeah.
the, yeah.
The
No
hardest thing
mosquitoes.
was packing. You had to have all your gear in one bag,
Yeah.
and they had to be kind of carry-on size bags, duffel bag type, and you could take a backpack. But that was the hardest thing was, and I did take too much stuff. So, but the
Better
guide,
enough more than not enough, right?
well, yeah.
Except you do a lot of walking with your,
Oh, yeah.
and they didn't
Yeah.
want you to bring anything with wheels on it, so.
Yeah,
you
they
were
wore
carrying.
wheels because it
Cause the way they packed it when we went off to those huts to sleep and stuff.
Anybody get dumped?
Yeah, a couple.
Oh!
Did the horse buck?
no,
No.
it was these horses didn't bug.
It was
They
It
didn't-
shied, we were just walking along.
She was
Yeah.
good. I would hear this. Ooh. I looked back at you.
She forgot her girth.
No,
Not
The horse
her.
went right, I went left, I thought we were
Yeah,
going straight,
yeah.
the horse went, oops.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I hadn't fallen off since, like for
Right.
40 years. I thought, I lay there for a while like, is anything broken?
Did that really just happen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the first night, one of the ladies who hadn't ridden much, she fell off, but the horse fell.
Oh.
We were on that road, that path,
Yeah.
and on the edge of those paths were like little runoff areas so that water would run through like a creek. And she just let the horse kind of get to the edge, and then the horse rolled
Yeah.
and fell. So she was fine. I mean, she wasn't hurt, but
Well, at least they weren't very tall to fall off of.
That's what I thought,
Yeah.
thank you,
Just
just
short, yeah, right.
wasn't some 16
and where she
hand.
landed happened because there's so many rocks.
Yeah.
Where she landed was lucky. It was just
yeah.
like a little bare path, and
Yeah,
so she
could've
didn't.
hit a
She
rock.
jammed her finger.
Only thing I hurt was my finger.
Yeah.
Was-
Yeah.
I had a helmet on, of course, but
Yeah.
my head.
Well, they don't worry about with the lush grass founder or anything like that.
No, they don't have any problem with that. I asked that question.
Isn't that crazy?
But the horses aren't fed any feed unless they're
Yeah.
older or sick.
Yeah.
They live out in the pastures. They are the most hardy horses I've ever been around.
Yeah.
And they couldn't survive if they weren't.
Well, yeah.
And so they're born out in the pasture in the herds, and they're brought in. Like for the winter, each guide is assigned a horse to train. But they were brought in, she said, in back to 3, and so they have a saddle and a rider on them, and then turn back out, and then at 5 they train them, and they train them to do the tolls, and they're pretty naturally 5-gated. But like Erin was saying, that they like to do this piggy pace, which is sort of like what we would consider a foxtrotter gait.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you can tell it's not quite right, and they just get lazy, and from people riding them that are not experienced, and there were some that harder than others to get to do it, but you just sat deep. You really sat deep in the saddle and sat up,
Yeah.
almost leaning back a little bit, and then making your contact, and it pulled them up off that shoulder, and then you didn't use your heel, you used your calf.
Sounds
You
like a
just squeezed.
Pasifino a little
Very
bit.
similar.
Yeah.
It was similar.
Kind of sad.
If you've ever ridden a Pasifino, that's kind of how you
Yeah. Is
that how you
move
get them?
into their
Yeah.
gait too.
I
I
was
had-
amazed at the speed, because they told it up to
Yeah.
20 miles an hour, and then the flying toss would be 30 miles an hour.
Wow. That's crazy.
And that little bitty horse that I was with, she was the one that could do the flying pass.
Yeah.
And I mean, she was
How
phenomenal.
fun.
That was my most favorite horse, and she was probably 13 hands.
Yeah. Yeah.
I probably had a little more trouble tolting than they did because I ride Western and don't
Yeah.
ride very frequently.
Mhm.
And so every time I feel like when I'm riding with contact, that much contact, I feel like I'm trying to slow the horse
Stop them.
down.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you're trying to push forward with your legs in your seat while you're, and so I probably had a little more trouble than they did getting my horses to tolt because of that.
Yeah.
It was a struggle for me, my mind, to pull back and push forward with my seat at the same time.
Yeah.
But anyway.
The only horse I had trouble with, they put me on a younger green one because one of our horses like a kind of shoeing problem, and so they put this green one in the string. And she said, when you get on in the arena, I want you to sit lightly for a while. And I went, I mean, it's got a buck. And she said, just a little cold back, just sit lightly. So I mean, I'm like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
But it was fine until we got onto that mountain, and then the wind was just
That was
straight
a
line
bad
wind.
wind
It was so bad. And coming down, you're on, some of the trails were asphalt because it's a hiking
Yeah.
area. And he kept trying to turn his butt into the wind. Well, that drop off was straight down, and I couldn't get him to straighten up.
Yeah.
So I got off because I'm walking this
Right.
part of the trail.
Well, yeah. You have
Yeah.
more control.
But it was a lot of fun. I would really highly recommend any of these trips.
Yeah.
And I know I have
On me too, yeah.
Aaron's father
Especially-
ate horse meat. He said it was very lean. He said it was just like steak. It was
Yeah.
very lean.
Very lean.
I
Just
just
like
enjoyed
chicken,
myself
right?
too.
Thanks, ladies, thanks for coming.
Appreciate you.
Well, that was awesome, Kathy.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you, Mary, guys.
Oh, wow.
Howdy,
Look at
How you doing, ma'am?
We're good, how are
I
you?
thought I recognized a face. Aren't you our Comanche guy?
Yes, I am.